Today I'd like to take us to a passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11 that I'm sure you will agree with me that is very appropriate and points out our human condition. And it reads, "He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to the end." I think you would agree with me that it just doesn't take us long to see how short-sighted we really are. It has been said that we do not multitask in our thinking. We are consumed with what is happening in the here and now. It takes us captive. Our attention is drawn to the immediate. We problem solve based upon known problems that for the most part are affecting us in the present. Sure, we can plan for the future, but even then it is tied to the temporal, and its value in success or in failure is short-lived. The practicality of daily living tends to command our full attention. In the moment, our thoughts and circumstances can seem to be the most important and often more important than they actually are. And because of this, we become not only focused on the immediate problem, but emotionally attached to it. The immediate is all important. Life shrinks down to a moment in time, and as such, those tasks and desires confronting us right now seem to be critical, such as getting through traffic, getting the project completed, hitting the road for vacation, or buying that latest thing that we just got to have on Amazon. Our problem is that we just have tunnel vision. But as Solomon reminds us here in our text, we were created for more. We have eternity in our hearts. And while our attention focuses on the moment, our hearts will never be satisfied in just the present or short-term future. We will never truly find purpose or truly understand the mind of God with short-term thinking. And our text addresses this problem and starts with a response to Solomon's question in verse 9, where it reads, "What gain has the worker from his toil?" And his answer is found in three parts or three principles. First, everything is appropriate in its time. Again, verse 11 says, "And he has made everything beautiful in its time." Here the word beautiful can be translated appropriate or good. The same word is translated proper in chapter 5 in verse 18. And in context, in its time, that is, God in his providential plan and control has an appropriate time for every activity. It is not that the eternally minded are to ignore the present, but rather to understand it within the sovereign purposes of God, as we see in verses 1 through 8 of our present chapter, where it reads, "For everything there is a season and a time, for every matter under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to loose, and a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, and a time to keep silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." The idea here that Solomon is getting at is that there is an appropriateness for every season, every circumstance, and every task, and it is to be measured and understood or acknowledged in light of God's eternal purposes. We may not understand them at the time, but God is not confused, nor is the immediate out of God's control. And that brings me to the second principle. Solomon adds that people cannot know the works of God from beginning to end. That is, they cannot ultimately know the sovereign eternal plan of God. Again, verse 11 in the latter part. Yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to the end. Why? Because God is eternal and inhabits eternity. Isaiah 57:15 says, "For thus says the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place, and also with him who is of a contrite and lowly spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite." For man, human labor is without profit because we are ignorant of God's eternal plan, the basis by which he evaluates the appropriateness and eternal significance of all our activities. And because of this ignorance, there is an uncertainty and latent temporality to the value of one's labor. And this is only resolved by an abiding relationship with God through the saving and sanctifying work of Jesus Christ. We may not know with full and accurate certainty the purposes of God in the moment, but we know him who is just, holy, loving, and merciful. We don't inhabit eternity, but we know him who does. And then the third principle now comes into play. Again, in verse 11, right in the middle, also he has put eternity into man's heart. You see, God has given us a longing or a desire to know the extra-temporal significance of ourselves and of our deeds or activities. And because of this, as believers, we realize there are purposes in the mind of God that are greater than ourselves. Those purposes span from eternity past to eternity future. So the next time you read John 3:16 or John 10:10, realize that eternal life, an abundant life, has eternity and God's eternal purposes in mind.